Um, Hello, and welcome to Writers and Books Meet the BOA Author Series. I'm Sakshi Kumar, the Adult Programs Coordinator at Writers and Books. For those of you who are new to us, Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, a bookstore, and literary programming for people of all ages and backgrounds. You can find more information at our website, wab.org. Please feel free to say hello in the chat and let us know that you're here. Feel free to submit questions through the chat or the Q&A function as well. Books are available through our bookstore at Ampersand Books, and I'll put this link in the chat. Writers and Books would like to call attention to the complex and troubled history of the lands in which we live and work. We are hosting this event from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as the Senegal people, or the keeper of the Western Door. We're so happy to have Joe Baumann with us tonight. First, we'll hear him read. Then he'll be in conversation with author and poet Peter Connors, publisher and executive director of BOA Editions. 13 surreal short stories utilize the strange and the bizarre as a backdrop for explorations of loneliness, queer coming of age, self-discovery, and loss. Baumann's tender vignettes of love, anger, grief, and desire are a stunning ode to the places and people that can give us solace within an absurd and chaotic world. Joe Baumann is the author of 3 collections of short fiction: Sing With Me, At the Edge of Paradise, The Plagues, and Hot Lips. A 2019 Lambda Literary Fellow in fiction, his essays and works of fiction have appeared in Third Coast, Passages North, Phantom Drift, and elsewhere. His debut novel, I Know You're Out There Somewhere, is forthcoming from Deep Hearts YA. He can be reached at joebaumann.wordpress.com. Welcome, Joe.
All right. Well, thank you, Sakshi, for being our host. And I want to thank Peter and everybody at BOA Editions for helping bring this short story collection into the world. It's been, as I was telling Peter, really just a great experience with this organization. Every single step of the way has been really fantastic. And I'm really thrilled that it's here and that people can go get their hands on it. So I'm going to read one story out of this collection. It will not take me that long. And then I believe Peter is going to ask me some surely very challenging or at least fun questions. And then if anybody has any questions of their own, you can pop them into the Q&A and we'll hopefully have some time to answer those. So if you happen to have a copy of the book already, although it just came out today, so you may not. I'm going to read a story called Heave Your Dead to the Ground. It's on page 71 in here. So there are a number of scene breaks, so I will take a dramatic pause between each of them. So, okay. So like I said, this is called Heave Your Dead to the Ground. Hearts fell first. Harvey watched as they landed in yards, pelted shingles, dented the roofs of minivans. They destroyed gardens, squashed slicing tomatoes, bruised spinach leaves. They knocked branches from trees and smeared blood on bay and picture and double-hung windows, left dark streaks on doors, on driveways, on sidewalks, on patios. They stained Harvey's freshly sealed deck and frightened his dog. They frightened the neighborhood children. They frightened him. They filled the air with slapping noise and knocked over mailboxes. They bloodied skylights. They sat on driveways, shriveled like dead jellyfish, like deflated kickballs, like slabs of sallow meat. Harvey knew people ate chicken hearts, lamb hearts, cow hearts, ate them grilled and baked and stewed and stir-fried. He'd heard of beef heart stew, beef heart kebabs, pork sorpatel and bopies, pan-fried chicken hearts, pate with hidden heart, chicken heart stroganoff. But these were human hearts. "The hell's happening?" Lawrence said, calling from Palo Alto. He'd been offered a 1-year visiting professorship and had taken it. He and Harvey were trying to make it work. "I don't know. What are they saying on the news?" "You haven't watched?" Harvey shook his head, then remembered Lawrence wasn't there. "I've been looking outside. The hearts are everywhere." "What do they look like?" Harvey speared open his blinds. His house sat on the main thoroughfare that wended through his subdivision. Like fists, he said. Like fists with all the blood gathered in the knuckles. How are you feeling about it? Lawrence said. What kind of question is that? Harvey said. That was scene break. Harvey watched professionals in hazmat suits bend over the hearts, scooping them into biohazard coolers while men in tweed carrying shiny leather-covered Bibles, screamed about the rapture. Newscasters stood on sidewalks, their cameramen more concerned with where their feet fell than with getting a good shot in the right light. An email appeared in Harvey's inbox, inviting him to the home of the president of the HOA. When Harvey knocked, the president looked nonplussed by the hearts dotting his yard like large, lumpy dog turds. He waved for Harvey to come inside, where he offered Harvey a beer. The rest of his neighbors were drinking buttery white wine and standing in the kitchen around the island. So what do we think this is about? Someone said. Am I dreaming? Are we all dreaming? Well, wake me up. I hate this. The president calmed the screamers down as he refilled glasses of Gewürztraminer and whisked away empty St. Pauli girls. Even though he was wearing a t-shirt and chinos, he moved like he was wearing a tux and waltzing. He had long black hair that curled around his ears and shone in the pendant lights descending from the ceiling. Harvey looked away, but nodded when the president took his empty beer bottle and asked if he wanted another. Who here is driving, right? The president said with a wink. When he came back, beers slicked with condensation, he told everyone he'd already called the city. What about our yards, our driveways? How much will it cost to get cleaned up? Are the hearts toxic? The president raised his hands, palms facing outward. With lidded eyes, as if he was in a trance, he said not to worry. He would make some more calls. The word calls was like a lullaby. When I walked outside, I'd almost forgotten about the hearts, Harvey told Lawrence on the phone that night. Sounds like you're in love. Whatever, it's weird shit. Weird shit brings people together. Lawrence, I'm tired. It's not even 10 there. Long day tomorrow. Meetings. I'm going to let you go. As Harvey set down his phone, he thought of the moment that afternoon as he picked his way down the street. He'd glanced back and seen the president standing on his porch, smiling and nodding, as if to say, yes, go, yes, you can make it home. Everything will be all right. Eyes, looking like desiccated grapes, fell next. Most burst into iridescent goop, but a few retained their shape, bouncing off the soft surfaces of plastic playhouses, buoyed by creeks, pillowed by piled leaves. They stared up, wide and unblinking. Optic nerves fluttered like torn feathers. I swear, Harvey said, one of the ones that fell in the front bushes looked like my grandmother's. I'd recognize that shade of blue anywhere. Lots of people have the same color eyes, Lawrence said. Okay, sure, fine, I know that. More body parts fell. Intestines left brown trails behind. Livers landed with sickening sex slaps against front stoops and bedroom windows. Harvey watched jawbones stick in yards like thrown horseshoes, teeth looking ready to chatter out terrifying hymns. He watched rib cages come crashing into the street, bones splintering into strewn hay. Spinal cords clattered against sliding doors, tangled themselves in wicker furniture. Stomachs trapped themselves in pergolas, bloaty with acid that ripped through paint and primer and wood and metal and sucked the life out of the flowers and grass. Harvey received another email invitation to the president's house, but when he showed up, he was the only person there. Hi, the president said. He had a pleasant baritone. He stepped aside and gestured for Harvey to come in. Am I early? Late? The president laughed. I thought we could think of it as a one-on-one. Oh. Beers were already waiting, sweaty Schlafly Hefeweizens sitting on the kitchen island. The president popped them open and handed one to Harvey. After he drank, he said, they're all unreasonable, convinced the world is coming to an end. They could be right, Harvey said. The president laughed. I guess they could be, but they have kids or grandkids to worry about. It warps how they see things. I'd say what's happening is pretty warped, Harvey said. Oh, I know. The president set down his beer and leaned against the marble so his triceps flexed. He was wearing a snug blue Under Armour t-shirt. What did you think you and I might figure out that the scientists haven't? The president smiled and shrugged. What are your theories? I don't really have any. You haven't dreamt or thought about it or talked it out with anyone? The president drank. What do your friends say? My friends? Surely they have opinions. Harvey bit his cheek. How to admit to the president that he'd moved here for Lawrence's graduate program at WashU, that he hadn't seen his friends in ages, that the only person to whom he had any connection was now halfway across the country. He was saved by the hands. Their sudden arrival was hard and loud. Harvey and the president rushed to the living room window to watch them fall. The fingers landed in a vast array, some clenched into fists, others splayed like they were about to be buffed at a nail salon. Some broke, skewing at unnatural angles. Others pointed to the sky or poked into soft soil. They curved into letters in American Sign Language. They caught in the crepe myrtle, in the president's yard, and the plane trees and hedges across the street. The sound of them hitting sedans and tool sheds was like the end of the world. People arrived in droves. They took pictures. They set up food trucks. Men and women with bullhorns preached the gospels while their followers swayed, hands up and eyes closed, their voices shattering the morning quiet while Harvey slept. He pierced his window blinds and groaned, seeing clumps of people up and down the street, eyes rolled toward heaven, hands clasped. He wondered if he could call the police and complain about noise. Harvey watched them stare at the sky. He opened his front door so he could hear and felt a hard anger when he heard one man ask God for more body parts to fall. They picked through abandoned yards for dried up pancreas and testicles and tarsal bones left behind by the scientists, shoving them without fear of contamination or illness into plastic containers and paper bags, as if collecting icons of departed saints. He watched them scrape up humerus bones from sidewalks using snow shovels. They collected blood dripping from trees with vials and buckets and pitchers you might use to serve beer. I saw you on the national news, Lawrence texted. A reporter had caught Harvey in his driveway while he was checking the mail, dodging around a fresh rain of toes. They reminded him of maggots, and he'd stepped on one. It had let out an unsatisfying, wet crunch. The reporter had not asked him much, sticking a microphone in his face and asking for a quick soundbite while his camera operator stared at the sidewalk once he'd gotten Harvey in frame. Harvey hemmed and hawed, blinked and squinted into the sun, and couldn't even remember afterward what he'd said. A few families moved out, tried to sell their houses unsuccessfully, took out second mortgages so they could rent apartments somewhere else, where roofs weren't subject to flapping heavy lungs. They pulled their kids from their Montessori schools and private Christian academies to save on tuition. Images of houses, close-ups of yards and trees drizzled with viscera while preachers and gawkers and lab technicians bristled on the sidewalks, appeared online. In the pictures, yards were weedy, bushes were unkempt, tangled with blood vessels. Harvey watched the neighborhood go to seed, turning into a series of haunted houses, full of whispers and dust and ghosts. Have you heard the conspiracy theories? Lawrence said. Conspiracy theories? Lawrence told him. People thought it was all an invention, that all the photos and videos were doctored, that Harvey and his neighbors were attention seekers, living boring lives in the suburbs who hated their jobs as bank managers and primary school teachers and IT specialists and low pay grade accountants. Jesus, of course we're not making it up. Some say that the government is running experiments and are dumping their refuse from the tippy top of Earth's atmosphere, Lawrence said. You don't believe any of that, do you? Then there's the theory that the parts aren't real, plastic and cornstarch and rubber. Lawrence, Harvey said, you know it's all real, right? I've seen it up close. But you're on the inside, Lawrence said. Ha! Harvey knew Lawrence was joking, or at least he thought so. He felt a spike in his side. You could never be sure, could you? You could come out here, Lawrence said. And do what? It was just a suggestion. Harvey said nothing. Neither did Lawrence. Though they were both breathing, it was as if they'd hung up. 2 emails arrived in a row. A third invitation to the president's house, a follow-up meeting and a barbecue, the language fluffy and enthusiastic, as if the world wasn't falling down around their driveways and front stoops and raised bed gardens. Then a note sent only to Harvey, promising that this time it would not be just the 2 of them. I hope, the note ended, that you didn't feel deceived last time. Harvey didn't respond, but he did go. The president served stuffed olives and hard alcohol. He smoked ribs, and Harvey could smell them as he walked up the driveway. Inside, everything sparkled, and the air was filled with pledge, pine sol, apples, and cinnamon. Harvey stood around, drinking from the rum and coke he'd been poured, and listened to everyone complain. Eventually, he made his way onto the back patio where the meat had curled into hard, dark slabs. The president was alone out there. I'm glad you came, he said. Thanks for having us. I feel like it calms them down. The olives are good. The president smiled. You can thank Trader Joe's then. I just paid for them. An important step. The gathering passed into evening. More people arrived, and most of them got drunk. They stumbled away after filling their bellies with the ribs, which were tender and spicy. Paper plates were scattered across the kitchen island. Harvey started stacking them, pulling plastic forks and shredding napkins into their own heaps. And shredded napkins into their own heaps. No need, the president said. Just trying to help, Harvey said. Oh, you did, the president said. He was rinsing off a pair of tongs. He turned from the sink. Just by being here. Harvey felt like he'd swallowed a jawbreaker, a hard ball of steel hanging in his throat. People here have theories too, Lawrence said. He'd called late, nearly 11. Harvey's eyes were heavy. He could still feel the pulse of rum in his limbs. I bet they do. Do you want to hear the wildest? Do I? One woman said to me, maybe heaven is kicking out its dead. How lame is that? We don't really have any answers. I didn't say you did. No, you didn't. You should come out here, just for like a week. I'm really busy, Harvey said. Doing what? That night, Harvey dreamt he stood in heaven on its pillows of cumulus. He could see the blue and brown marbled earth. God stood next to him, heaving bodies toward the continental U.S. Harvey watched them break apart upon entry into the atmosphere, blood and bone and viscera spreading in an atomized cloud. He woke, sweating. He wiped his brow and squinted in the dark to make sure he wasn't oozing any blood. Phalanges were little hailstones on skylights. Latissimus dorsi muscles flailed down like fallen stingrays. Harvey sent the HOA president a picture. He responded with a landscape of his backyard covered in mammary glands. The crowds had thinned, whether out of impatience, an overload of grotesquerie, or something else. Harvey wasn't sure. Scientists still milled about, ready to collect fresh samples, but most of them had packed up, trundling off to labs to study the body parts. Harvey had no idea what conclusions they might draw. Reporters had stopped coming around, realizing the story wasn't developing into anything of new interest aside from the question of the day. What would fall next? Things are feeling quieter, Harvey said to Lawrence. You sure you're not just acclimating? I know my own experience. The president called, and Harvey answered, his mouth sticky before he even said hello. Without any hesitation, the president invited Harvey to go for a beer. Somewhere that we won't have to worry about falling body parts. I could do that, Harvey said. They sat on the patio at what the president called his favorite bar. Their table, wrought iron, was shaded by an umbrella advertising Michelob Ultra. The president ordered them a pitcher of his favorite pale ale. They squeezed orange slices into their pint glasses. I think it's going to stop soon, the president said. You do? I've been keeping track. He told Harvey how he'd printed off lists of the various human body systems. Did you know we have 11 of them? He listed them off. We mostly only think about the musculoskeletal because it's what we can see the most. The president flexed his bicep, which bulged beneath the roll of his sleeve. He laughed at himself and drank. They fell into a long silence. You like it here? The president said finally. I grew up in the suburbs, Chicago, so it's all familiar. I stayed there for school. Harvey almost started in on his entire story, how he and Lawrence met at Northwestern, Harvey graduating with a degree in English not because he wanted to write, but because he loved nothing as much as he loved reading books. How he'd followed Lawrence, who had been accepted into the Brown School of Public Health and was now doing a stint out in California. How Harvey loved the job he had at a cozy bookstore, not just selling novels, but working the books. He'd minored in accounting for no reason other than the pride he took in his math skills. But the president didn't ask, so Harvey didn't share. This is nice, the president said. He waved his hands toward the parking lot and strip mall around them. No ears falling upon us. It's weird how easy it is to talk about it. The president drank. He smiled. Things happen that way sometimes. The air was tinged with that far-off smell of coming cold. Harvey thought of wood fires and fallen leaves, even though the only sign of change were the first briefest streaks of ochre in the trees. He thought of winter festivals, light shows, walking along lit paths while holding a hot chocolate spiked with rumplemints, arm threaded through Lawrence's peacoat. Do you think we'll ever get back to normal? He said. I don't care for normal. The president refilled his beer, asked Harvey if they should order another pitcher. When Harvey nodded, the president said, Normal is boring. I like things that are different. So this is all okay for you then? The president shrugged. What is okay? Okay can become good or bad quick, you know? Harvey blinked and looked toward the sky, his gaze so intense the president twisted to look, too, but there was nothing to see. They're offering me another year, Lawrence said. Already? Should I take it? How can I be the one to answer that? Harvey had taken to pacing the house when they talked on the phone. He glanced outside. The house across the street was empty. All Nervones had slashed through the trees in the night. I want to know what you think. Harvey was thinking about his body, his self. After they'd finished their second pitcher, the president drove them home, stopping outside Harvey's house, his F-150 growling as it idled on the curb. Before Harvey got out, the president touched his hand. Harvey thought they might kiss, but instead the president said, Let's do this again. It's nice to get out. Yeah, Harvey had said. It is. How, Harvey thought, would anything seem whole again when he'd been subjected to the show of so many disparate parts? At night, he trembled as he imagined the fallen hearts and hands and eyes. The lightest woof of noise jolted him, sent him rushing to a window to check for cheekbones bashing at the glass. Lawrence sighed. Please, he said, voice strained like a bowstring, just tell me what you're thinking. I don't know what I think. I think you have to choose. Will you come be with me? What about the house? I have an apartment. There's plenty of room. We have a lot here. There's a lot worth getting away from. Harvey sucked in a breath. I think it might be ending. How can you know that? Harvey's still living heart fluttered, capillaries squeezing blood to the surface. He shut his still living eyes. His still living hands were clenched, his calves tight. Sometimes, Harvey said, I think you just know. The end. Oh, thank you, Peter.
That was awesome. Thank you for reading that, Joe. It's great to hear that in your voice. So I'd love to ask you a few different questions about the collection itself and sort of putting it together. And I know that there are some stories in here that were written maybe up to like 10 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, but you've had other collections published since then. So I'm kind of curious, what about these stories felt like, now is the right time to collect them? And what about this collection in general made it feel like they would fit?
Yeah, so like you said, that is one thing that compared to the other short story collections I have that makes this one very different is in those cases, the stories therein were all written fairly close to each other, just in temporally. A couple of them are what I call my concept album collections. The one called The Plagues is 10 stories about the plagues of Egypt, sort of reimagined in modern terms. And then one of the other ones is very much kind of interconnected stories that all sort of work together. But yeah, with this one, well, this is a sort of a silly answer. It's partially true, but it's kind of a silly answer. Is I had years ago I had put together a collection and was just struggling to get any bites on it, but I knew that there were stories in it that were worthy of finding their way into something. And then when I was working on putting this collection together, there's a number of stories that are relatively, that by the time you all had taken the collection, that had existed for only, like a year or so. So, but you're right. There are stories that go back. I just was looking at the table of contents again today. It's like, wow, this is like there is like a 10-year spread on some of these. But in terms of deciding, which of those older stories to include, I sort of saw this sort of through line of sort of loss but both in terms of people who have lost something or people who know that a loss is imminent or are hoping to not lose something. And so I sort of plucked or are experiencing a couple versions of that, a couple of those things. And so I felt like the ones that I had sort of salvaged from this I sort of cannibalized them away from other places I thought they would fit, felt like they resonated in that particular kind of way. And before I submitted the manuscript, I did reread them and kind of see how so there were stories that I had not looked at in 6-7 years, and talk to any writer, that's a really long time in a writing life. And so I did kind of work on them a little bit before adding them to this, so they almost felt a little bit more like they were written by the writer that I am now, if that makes sense. But it was largely that kind of that thematic sensibility that I thought kind of sort of wove its way through them, even though the content in a lot of ways is very different, just in terms of what's going on plot wise.
Yeah, and I mean, you addressed this a little bit in your answer just now, but I'm curious, what did you learn about your writing, taking something from 10 years ago and then comparing it to what you're writing now?
Yeah,
Like, did
it's
you notice shifts?
I noticed that there are some just stylistic choices that I make a little differently these days. I had a reputation when I was in graduate school as being the guy who overdid it with metaphors and similes. It was a running joke that it was true. I would always have way more of those than probably necessary. So I actually found myself getting rid of some of those things in the versions that appear in this collection. There's maybe one or two per page fewer of those kinds of bits of writing, but then just even I've become a little less explanatory. What's my word? Right, like a little less explainy in terms of like there are strange things happening, and I'm not really concerned so much about finding logical underpinnings to them. In this story that I read, you never find out what's happening with the body parts that are appearing. And so I found that a couple of those stories that were older, both I as a writer and I was having my characters being more interested in finding those things out, and kind of in the revising of those pulled those pieces out a little bit more.
I think in some ways too, it's, that's you're sort of hitting on, to me, an important distinction of what makes surrealism different than, say, fantasy or science fiction or
Yeah.
horror, or whatever. The lack of explanation,
Yeah.
of like
Yep.
not having to do that.
Yep. Yeah. When I teach classes I teach a class every spring at the school that I teach at on writing science fiction, fantasy, and the surreal. And so we talk about like what distinguishes those. And sometimes it's hard to establish those distinction, and who really, who cares about labels, right? But yeah, well, I think the biggest distinction would be with if you put the surreal over here and science fiction and fantasy over here, it's that, science fiction, there is a scientific explanation, even if the story doesn't actually go into the science. And in fantasy, there's typically magic can explain, some kind of magic system explains how things work. Whereas over here in the surreal, the world, that's just how the world works, or it's just this odd thing that maybe gets explained somehow or doesn't, right? There can be like a rule system for it, but it's neither science nor magic. It's just, this is how this strange thing is, or it's just never explained at all.
Yeah. And I mean, for me as a reader, I always like surrealism, and I enjoy that sort of not explaining it part of surrealism as well. And it seems to me sometimes it can get at truths that, like, let's call it realism, can't get to,
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, for you as a writer of surrealistic pieces, what benefits do you get out of staying in those regions as opposed to veering into more explanatory things
Yeah.
or, realism?
Yeah, I guess that's I think what you sort of answered it for me in some capacity. I think what it allows me to do is to find a tangible thing that can serve as this sort of, I hate to say symbol, because that makes that oversimplifies it a little bit, because people will be like, oh, it means this, it represents this one thing. Like, so when I say symbol, I don't mean a one-to-one representation, but it allows me as the writer to ruminate on some intangible thing in a very tangible kind of way, right? Like making something physical and manifest that is otherwise kind of hiding under the surface. And as a writer, I think I find it easier to do that with a weird thing. I mean, there are so many great writers who do this with sort of your literary realism. I don't think I'm one of them. I think I lean toward finding the strange thing. But then on the other end, I actually really, I often, and I may be, hopefully I'm not overly predicting a question of yours, but I'm going to answer it even if it's not a question you're going to ask, is I actually usually start with the weird thing first and then have to figure out what it means. So I'm like, oh, what if this thing is happening? What's that about? Right. So oftentimes I have the bizarre or the surreal kind of component. And that's part of the puzzle that I enjoy, is figuring out, okay, I'm going to write a story about, the first story, the title story in this collection came from the idea of, okay, a kid can make clouds. I just had that idea and I thought, well, what's that about? What do I do with that idea? So I just enjoy the challenge of making some meaning out of it. It's like this puzzle that I'm figuring out, if that makes sense. Like, okay, I can come up with this wacky premise, and what do I do with that? And that's the part of the process that I really enjoy. So I've leaned into the thing that I enjoy doing, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I was in really specific to the story that you just read, that did occur to me of you have these great relationships that are very realistic, between the partners, or between, with the president and so forth. And it's like, yeah, these appear in realistic stories all over the
Sure.
place, right? They're
Yeah.
just relationships, really, when it comes down to it. And you do them extremely well,
Well,
the
thank you.
subtleties of these interactions and everything like that. But you got hearts falling and hands falling and all these different things.
Yeah.
So I am curious, and maybe you did just answer, but like, is the relationships the focus, or is the
So
stuff
so
the focus?
in this story, this went through a really weirdly circuitous route. In this story, I started with I don't. I must have gotten. I steal my ideas all the time. Like I read something and go, "Ooh, this writer has just said this little tiny thing. I'm gonna take that and write my own big story." I mean, I steal all the time, and I am not. I am not secretive about it. Like I tell my students, I still tell other people. I read a lot, and I just steal little tiny moments from other writers, and then turn those into my stories. So with this one, I don't remember what the original source material was, but I had this idea of what if body parts are falling down in a suburb? And I actually had originally tried just writing that story and didn't have our main character, Harvey, or Lawrence, or the president at all. And I got through a version that was basically just a collective voice of a sort, like a neighborhood dealing with this. And I just thought to myself, something's missing here. And it wasn't anyone's story. It was just this like collective we group narrator, and I couldn't really get into like why does this matter, because I just had a story of a neighborhood falling apart and I didn't have anyone really specifically experiencing something. And so then I thought of, okay, what if there's someone dealing with something, and I came up with this guy who's living alone because his partner is halfway across the country, while this crazy thing that is sort of taking over the lives of these people around them. And then I thought, well, and then what was struck me was where, Harvey is clearly feeling sort of left behind in some way. And that's when I thought, there needs to be someone who is potentially making him feel like he doesn't want to leave. Because if it's as simple as I'll just go to California, then there's no tension there. And so that's when I was like, well, let's give him someone that maybe has a kind of promise that you can tell that things are strained between him and Lawrence. And I of course didn't want to just say that, but hopefully you get it from reading the way that their conversations go. And then so that's how the president of the HOA came to be. So I actually didn't have the first draft of the story didn't have any of those three people in it, but I could tell something wasn't quite right. And so I thought, let me try revising that and getting at an individual that's in the story. And so that all came after all of the body parts were already there before any of them appeared in the story. It's probably the story that actually, with the exception of the title story, is the one that underwent the most sort of transformation.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, it makes me think, I think sometimes people can, look at a surrealistic story or something and just focus on, well, that's just, weird stuff. But here's the thing, you could write something that's just weird and it wouldn't be compelling and you wouldn't want to read it because it's not telling a story. There's just strange things happening isn't a story. It's just
strange things happening.
Just strange things happening. So we need, as readers, we need character, we need, tension, we need all those different things that go across any kind of story that you're telling.
Exactly. Yeah.
In one of the author questionnaire answers that you put before the book came out, so I should explain, we give all our authors, as many publishers do, an author questionnaire and ask them different things about the book so that they can talk about it, and it helps us talk about it as publishers. And we asked you to sum up the book in just like 3 or 4 words. And your response was surreal queer discontent.
Yep.
Which I love. For some reason, I heard that and I was like, it sounds like a Radiohead song or something. I don't know. There's something about it. It's like, does that still feel now, probably a year or a year and a half past when you did that, and spending a lot more time with the book too, as happens before publication? Does that still feel pretty accurate to you?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, and I think I worry that I'm becoming a broken record, because I think I've said that about a couple of my other books as well. So people are like, oh boy, well, this is gonna be a bit of a downer, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I think so. And to explain that answer for anyone listening in or watching, the reason I use the word discontent is because I think it encompasses all of the different kind of emotional states that I think the characters in the stories in this book experience, right? Like unfulfilled desire, loneliness, grief. Those are all kinds of discontent that I think the various characters within those stories are sort of grappling with and trying to figure out. And not every story is a queer story. Most of them are. But I think but they all pretty much are all surreal. So they're all weird. So, but yeah, I think that descriptor, I think still feels like the right trio of words for that. I had forgotten about that.
Yeah. Well, you also said, and I'm going to read a little bit of what your answer was, because you also said, As a queer writer, I'm always trying to centralize queer characters, but not necessarily their queerness. Why not write about all the other stuff that LGBTQIA plus people experience in the same ways that heteronormative folks do? And then later on, you said, I also hope that readers who aren't LGBTQ plus discover how tender and challenging it can be to discover and embrace who you are, particularly in our current climate that seems to be trying to twist and force queer people back into a place of marginalized, closeted silence. In many of my stories, too, I simply place queerness within the world as a perfectly normal thing because that's what it should be. Queer writers have been asked/forced to place queerness as the central element of characters' lives for so long, when they should really simply be another part of their lives, as is the case for heterosexual cisgender folks.
Wow, that old me was pretty smart. I don't remember writing that at all, but I'll take credit. I'll take it. I'll take it. Yeah, I mean, well, and I was actually, it's kind of, it's the timing is coincidental. Won't say ironic, coincidental. I was in one of my classes today. My students were watching an interview with the great writer Kristen Arnett, where she talks a little bit about this, where in her novel Mostly Dead Things, there's no coming out moment. Jessa, the main character, is already out. Everybody knows this about her, and it's not really central to the story. What is central is her battle with willingness to be vulnerable and to let other people into who she is, which again is sort of to what I apparently said in the answer to that question, is something that anybody sort of experiences at some point or another, I think, right? You know, and this is not to say that coming out stories aren't important. Good Lord, anyone that's read my YA novel, which has now since come out, so it is available, is it's a teenage boy's sort of not well, it's both a coming out story and what I call a coming into self, like recognizing things about yourself story. So this is not to say that coming out stories are not important and that it's not like I scowl at them. I read them all the time. But like I said, I do also want there to be stories where it's, you know, it just so happens that this character is in a same-sex relationship or is transgender or is asexual or aromantic or whatever. Those are just, you know, because many at least straight presenting stories don't make a big deal of the person realizing or announcing to the world that they are straight, right? That's just taken for granted. And so, you know, I have come to a point as in sort of the maturation or transformation of my writing self and what interests me in moving kind of away from the coming out story. Like I said, there are tons and tons of great writers who are doing those stories justice, and they're still sort of important. But I feel like I'm kind of past them in that way. In a way, I'm just more interested in what are the daily lives, even if the world in which those lives exist is very strange, of trying to navigate and happening to be an LGBTQ person.
Yeah. And I'm curious, if you could mention, you've said a couple different authors and books, but what authors and books do you feel were really influential in this book in particular, this type of writing?
Yeah, so in this book, there's a number of sort of the surrealists that are doing a lot of this now that I like to imagine I'm in conversation with, even if they have no idea who I am. So the first names that come to mind are Amy Bender, who writes sort of the wonderfully strange stories, and Ramona Osabel, whose short story collection, A Guide to Being Born, is one of my favorites. When I think about sort of the approach to kind of using language in the kind of vibrant way that the great writers do, there's a really great, I believe she's from South Carolina, so sort of like coastal Southern Gothic writer. Her name is Julia Elliott, so she really does all this really fun, fabulous stuff with just the way that she writes her stories. And hers kind of teeter on sort of this like sort of weird, messy Flannery O'Connor-esque kind of sci-fi almost. It's very hard to describe exactly what it is. I mean, those terms are all good positive qualities I'm identifying. But those are some of the writers that definitely I think heavily influenced my approach to these stories. I would also say there's a writer named Matthew Baker who I read his story, his collection, Why Visit America, especially when I was when I was writing the story I read. Just stylistically, his approach is these like really long, sort of winding sentences with like sort of these lists of things that you think okay, now it's going to stop. Now it's going to stop. But they go on sort of at length, and I kind of borrowed a little bit of that in this story. So I would mention him as well.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I could talk to you all night, but unfortunately our time is up. If you
Okay.
would, oh, I did want to mention, so is it tomorrow that you start the Instagram takeover for
Yes,
Boa?
yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes,
So
I
if
will be
anybody's,
taking over, yep, the Boa Editions Instagram account tomorrow.
yes, and we will get more insights into your writing and influences and excerpts of the book and all sorts of stuff. But it's a beautiful collection. Congratulations on it. I'm so thrilled that Boa published it. And if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to step out. Would you share a little bit more writing from the book with us
Yes,
before
sure,
we go?
yes. As we wrap, I'm just going to read the very first page of what might actually be, no, it's not the first story that I've wrote in this collection, but it's one that as any writer will maybe tell you, being asked what your favorite story is if you have kids, is like being asked about your favorite child. But for a long time, this was one of my favorite stories that I read. So I'm just going to read one page of a story called For Rent.
Thank you, Joe. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks, Peter. The artist living in Valerie's ribcage would like to know if she could please try to tone it down with the rough sex. The thing is, Val tries to explain, Jace is the first boyfriend she's ever had with visible abs and well-manicured pubic hair and leg muscles whose striations she can see twitch when they move. So she feels like stifling their loose rollicking might be asking a bit much. He's also funny and smart and sensitive, and after they make love, he holds her in his arms and she feels enveloped in clouds. Sighing, the artist runs a hand through his hair, which is always shining and slick like he's just showered, though she's pretty sure he hasn't found a way to install a bathroom in there between her intercostal muscles. But everything in that region is numb now anyway, so who can say? It's like breathing while buried in snow. Okay, he says, nodding. I get it. I like abs too. Who doesn't? He wonders, though, if she could try to keep her window of vigorous lovemaking a little more, what's the word, consistent? But that's the thing, she tells him. It's the spontaneity that really gets her going. He says he knows. The way her heart starts thumping is like someone banging on a steel bass drum right next to his easel. It sounds, he says, like the world is coming to an end. So I will stop there since we are out of time.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Thank you for the wonderful, wonderful reading. And thank you, Peter, for such a great conversation. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. I want to kind of re-echo something that Joe said, which is, I know you're out there somewhere, is out.
Yeah, no, that was my
and-
fault. I sent you an old bio.
and, and I've linked where can I take you when there's nowhere to go in the chat if you're interested in pre-ordering it. And yeah, have a great night, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everybody.